The winter of 1938 settled over Harlem like a quiet test. The kind of cold that did not simply touch skin, but pressed against the spirit. Coal smoke curled lazily above rooftops. Street lamps hummed against the evening frost. And somewhere beneath it all, dignity struggled to breathe in a city that too often tried to choke it. Samuel Carter walked with the careful posture of a man who had learned early that the world watched him differently. He was not a large man, nor particularly imposing. His suits were always brushed clean, even when worn thin at the elbows. His shoes polished, his voice calm. He had once studied literature at City College before economic collapse forced him back into Harlem's tight grip. Now he ran a small repair shop on 134th Street. Radios, clocks, anything broken that still had a chance at usefulness. Samuel believed in repairing things, even people. That belief would be tested. Across town, a bank manager named Harold Whitmore prepared to make an example of someone. The city was tightening its fists around working-class neighborhoods. Loans were disappearing, businesses folding. Harlem, especially, was being reassessed, as they politely called it. Whitmore did not use slurs. He did not shout. He believed himself civilized. But he carried a quieter cruelty, the kind that hides behind policy and paperwork. Samuel had applied for a modest loan to expand his repair shop into the vacant unit beside him. Nothing extravagant, just enough to hire 2 local boys and keep them from drifting toward trouble. He had rehearsed his proposal carefully, numbers neat, projections modest, dignity intact. When he entered Whitmore's office, he removed his hat and greeted the secretary with a soft nod. The walls were lined with framed photographs of donors and civic leaders. None looked like him. Whitmore barely glanced up as Samuel sat down. "You understand," Whitmore said, fingers steepled. "That expansion requires stability." "I do," Samuel replied evenly. "And this district," Whitmore continued, sliding the application aside without reading it fully, "has not shown long-term stability." Samuel did not react immediately. He understood what was being said without it being spoken. "I've operated without debt for 6 years," he answered. "My records are included," Whitmore smiled thinly. "It's not about records, Mr. Carter. It's about risk." There it was. Risk. A word that often meant something else. Samuel felt heat rise in his chest, not anger, but something heavier. The familiar weight of being measured before being known. "Are you saying I'm unqualified?" he asked calmly. Whitmore leaned back. "I'm saying the bank has to protect its investments." Behind the door, 2 junior clerks whispered and chuckled quietly. Samuel heard it. He always heard it. Whitmore stamped the paper without reading page 3. Denied. Samuel stood slowly. He did not argue. He did not plead, but as he placed his hat back on his head, he said something that would linger longer than Whitmore expected. "Sir, I don't need you to believe in me, but one day you may wish you had." Whitmore laughed. Actually laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just dismissively. And that sound followed Samuel all the way back to Harlem. That evening, the shop was quiet. The neighborhood children still pressed their noses to the window to watch him repair ticking clocks and humming radios. To them, he was not small. He was magic. One boy lingered longer than the others. David, 12 years old, sharp eyes. 2. "Sharp, did they give it to you?" David asked softly. Samuel shook his head once. David looked down at the cracked sidewalk. "They never do." Samuel knelt beside him. "Listen carefully, David. A door closed is not the same as a future denied." David frowned. "Feels like it." Samuel smiled gently. "Only if you stop knocking." That night, Samuel did not sleep much. But not because of anger. He was thinking, because humiliation, when carried with restraint, becomes fuel. And Samuel Carter did not intend to waste it. Over the next weeks, something strange began happening. Samuel did not seek another bank, he did not complain publicly. Instead, he began visiting shop owners along Lenox Avenue, but not for money. For partnership. He repaired radios for free in exchange for shared advertising, fixed broken heaters in exchange for shelf space, helped a struggling seamstress repair her sewing machine, and in return, she stitched uniforms for his shop. Slowly and visibly, a network formed, not based on charity, based on dignity, and Harlem noticed. A newspaper reporter from the Amsterdam News stopped by after hearing whispers of the repairman building something. "What are you building?" she asked. Samuel adjusted a wire inside a radio and replied without looking up. "Opening up. Nay. Community that doesn't need permission." She wrote that down. Meanwhile, Whitmore received troubling reports. The repair shop had doubled its customer base. The vacant unit next door was no longer empty. Samuel had expanded anyway, not through debt, through loyalty. Whitmore frowned at the figures. It did not make sense. Harlem businesses were supposed to collapse without institutional backing. He scheduled a visit, not out of admiration, out of irritation. The day Whitmore walked into 134th Street, the neighborhood felt slightly quieter, not hostile, just aware. Samuel greeted him the same way he had weeks earlier. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore scanned the space, organized shelves, 3 young apprentices working carefully, customers chatting warmly. "You seem busy," Whitmore observed. "We are," Samuel replied. Whitmore walked slowly, inspecting like a landlord. "You manage this without a loan?" "Yes." "How?" Samuel looked him in the eye. "We believed in each other." Whitmore scoffed softly. "That won't scale." Samuel smiled. "It already has." At that moment, something shifted, not loudly, but profoundly. Whitmore realized something he had not anticipated. He had not denied a man. He had underestimated one. But this was only the beginning, because pride rarely accepts correction gracefully. And humiliation, when experienced by the powerful, can turn dangerous. Whitmore returned to the bank with something darker in his expression. If Samuel Carter would not bend, then perhaps he would be pressured. The snow did not fall that week. It hovered. Gray clouds sat low over Harlem like something undecided, as though even the sky were waiting to see what kind of men would emerge from the choices ahead. Samuel Carter sensed it before it began, the subtle tightening of space, the shift in tone when certain doors opened and closed, the way conversations quieted when unfamiliar shoes stepped onto 134th Street. Success, especially the quiet kind, unsettles those who mistake control for order. Harold Whitmore did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not need to. Men like him understood that influence could travel invisibly through ink and seal, through committee rooms and whispered concerns about standards. A week after his visit to Samuel's shop, a letter arrived, polite, sterile, devastating, zoning. Reassessment notice. The city would be conducting a review of all small commercial properties in the district. Compliance inspections would begin immediately. Licenses would be re-evaluated. Safety codes re-examined. Coincidence, perhaps, but the inspections began with Samuel's block. On the first morning, 2 inspectors arrived with clipboards and thin smiles. They measured ceiling height, counted shelves, examined wiring that had functioned safely for years. One of them circled minor issues in red pencil, as if discovering treasure. Samuel stood beside them calmly. "Is there a specific complaint?" he asked. "Routine," one inspector replied. They returned the next day, and the next, each time finding something new. A shelf too close to the window, a minor paint chip, a technicality about square footage that had never before mattered. Fines accumulated like silent snowfall. David, now officially apprenticing under Samuel, clenched his fists in the back room. "This ain't routine," he muttered. Samuel heard him. He always heard everything. He placed a hand on David's shoulder. Anger is a tool, he said quietly, but only when held steady. David swallowed his frustration. They're trying to shut us down. Yes, Samuel replied evenly. They are. There was no panic in his voice, and that frightened David more than if there had been. Across town, Whitmore attended a luncheon with other bank executives. He spoke casually of risk containment and neighborhood recalibration. He never mentioned Samuel by name. He did not need to. The machinery had already begun moving. What unsettled him was not that Samuel had expanded, it was that he had done so without bending. Defiance, even dignified defiance, could not be allowed to spread, because dignity is contagious. 3 weeks into inspections, the fines reached an impossible sum, enough to cripple a modest business. Samuel gathered his apprentices after closing one evening. The lights hummed softly above them. I will not ask you to stay if this becomes unstable, he said. David stepped forward first. I'm not leaving. The others nodded. Samuel felt something tighten behind his ribs, not fear, not pride, but responsibility. These boys had placed their futures in his steadiness. He would not let bitterness poison what they were building. But that did not mean he would surrender. The true escalation came on a Thursday afternoon. A city notice was nailed to the door. Temporary closure pending compliance review. The word temporary felt like a lie. A small crowd gathered outside. Neighbors read it in silence. No shouting. Just the heavy weight of recognition. This had happened before, to other shops, other dreamers. It was how progress was quietly erased. Samuel removed the notice carefully. He did not tear it. He folded it. Then he locked the door from the outside and turned to the crowd. We will reopen, he said simply. How? Someone asked. Samuel looked at the faces. Seamstresses, barbers, grocers, mothers holding children by the hand. The same way we built it, he answered. No speech. No rally. Just certainty. That night, Whitmore received a phone call he had not expected. Not from Samuel, from a city council member. There's a tension gathering, the councilman said cautiously. Community papers are starting to ask questions. Whitmore frowned. Questions about compliance? Questions about selective compliance. Whitmore ended the call without responding. He had underestimated something again. Not Samuel's intelligence, but his restraint, because Samuel did not respond to closure with outrage. He responded with visibility. The following Sunday, instead of opening his shop, Samuel set up a folding table outside on the sidewalk. On it, he placed broken radios and clocks that customers had brought earlier in the week. He began repairing them there. In the open air. Neighbors gathered. Children watched. Amsterdam news reporter returned, camera in hand. They shut you down, she said. For now, Samuel replied. And you're not fighting? Samuel adjusted a small gear carefully. I am fighting. She tilted her head. This, he said softly, is how. The image of Samuel repairing. Radios beneath the gray sky ran on the front page the next day. Local businessman serves community despite closure. Whitmore read it twice. Then again. It was infuriating, not because Samuel was breaking rules, but because he wasn't. He was obeying them. Publicly. Calmly. And exposing their absurdity. Pressure intensified. Inspectors returned with stricter demands. Utility providers delayed responses. Suppliers received quiet warnings about extending credit. The message was clear. Isolation. Samuel felt the squeeze tightening. Yet something unexpected occurred. Customers began paying in advance. Neighbors organized small fund pools. The seamstress he once helped stitched a banner that read, "We repair what others discard." It hung above the sidewalk table. David watched it ripple in the cold wind and felt something change inside him. Not rage. Resolve. One evening, as Samuel packed up tools after another long day outside, A black sedan pulled to the curb. Whitmore stepped out. No entourage. No inspectors. Just him. He approached slowly, glancing at the banner overhead. "You're making this difficult," Whitmore said. Samuel closed his toolbox gently. "For whom?" "For yourself," Whitmore replied. "This could end quietly." Samuel met his gaze. "It already is quiet." Whitmore's jaw tightened. "You think public sympathy will save you?" "I don't need saving," Samuel said. "I need fairness." Whitmore leaned closer. "Fairness is earned." There it was again, the belief that dignity required permission. Samuel did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did something far more destabilizing. He stepped aside and gestured to the small crowd watching from nearby stoops. "Ask them if I've earned it." Whitmore glanced around. Eyes met his, not hostile, not violent, just unwavering. For the first time, Whitmore felt something unfamiliar. Isolation, the kind he had tried to manufacture. And in that moment, the power dynamic shifted, not through force, not through threat, but through collective stillness. Whitmore left without another word. But he was not finished. Men accustomed to control rarely retreat without one final attempt to assert it. And Samuel knew the true test had not yet arrived. Because pressure can become persecution, and persecution reveals the deepest measure of a man. The snow finally began to fall that night. Slow, deliberate, as if heaven itself were bearing witness. And somewhere beneath the quiet accumulation of white, a greater confrontation was preparing to rise. By early spring, the snow had melted, but the pressure had not. It had simply changed shape. What began as inspections and fines had evolved into something far more deliberate, a campaign not just to close a shop, but to dismantle a reputation. And in 1938 Harlem, reputation was survival. A man could rebuild walls, replace windows, repaint a storefront. But once doubt crept into the minds of neighbors, it spread faster than fire through dry timber. Samuel Carter understood that better than most. He had reopened his shop 3 weeks earlier after meeting every demand the city placed before him. No matter how petty. He had repainted walls twice, rewired systems that had already been approved, paid fines he knew were unjust without once stepping into a courtroom. The banner stitched by the seamstress still hung proudly above the doorway. Business had returned, not booming, but steady. The apprentices worked carefully. David had grown taller. Customers lingered longer. The shop had become more than a place of repair. It had become proof. And proof makes powerful men uncomfortable. The true escalation came in the form of accusation. It began with a rumor whispered in the back room of a wholesale supplier. Samuel Carter had been operating without proper federal documentation during his temporary closure. A small infraction, perhaps, but framed correctly, it could imply fraud. The rumor found its way to a local paper less sympathetic than the Amsterdam News. The headline was cautious but poisonous. Questions arise around Harlem shop's compliance. The word questions is a clever weapon. It suggests suspicion. Without responsibility. Samuel saw the paper before opening the shop that morning. He stood outside beneath the stitched banner and read every line. It was carefully written. No direct accusation, just implication. Words like investigation, uncertainty, possible oversight. David read over his shoulder, fists already tightening. "They're lying," he whispered. "No," Samuel replied calmly. "They're implying. That's worse." Samuel folded the paper neatly and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Truth doesn't panic," he said quietly. "And neither will we." But beneath his steady tone, something stirred. Not fear. He had endured worse, but recognition. This was no longer about business compliance. This was about public humiliation. Someone wanted him questioned in front of his own community. Someone wanted the doubt to settle like dust on the very loyalty that had protected him. By noon, 2 federal agents arrived. They wore sharp suits and thinner expressions. They did not knock politely. They entered as though expecting resistance. "Samuel." "Carter." The taller one asked. "I am." Samuel replied evenly. "We'll need to review your operational records during the period of closure." "Of course," Samuel said, gesturing toward his desk. The apprentices froze. Customers went silent. Outside, neighbors slowed their pace to watch through the front window. The agents began flipping through documents methodically, deliberately, letting pages rustle louder than necessary. One of them held up a receipt. "This invoice is dated during your closure period." "Yes," Samuel said. "Meaning you conducted business?" "No," Samuel replied. "Meaning someone paid in advance." The agent looked unconvinced. The other agent leaned closer. "It would be unfortunate if your recent community support were built on irregularities." There it was again. The suggestion. The attempt to cast shadow where there was light. Samuel did not defend himself emotionally. He did not match their tone. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He stepped aside. "Gentlemen," he said, voice measured, "you're welcome to inspect everything. But understand something clearly. You are not just examining receipts. You are examining trust. And trust does not belong to me alone." The taller agent smirked faintly. "Trust doesn't exempt anyone from law." "Nor does prejudice," Samuel replied softly. The room tightened. For a brief second, something unspoken hung in the air. The agents resumed their search, but the balance had shifted. They had expected anxiety. They had expected defensiveness. They had not expected composure. After 2 hours, they found nothing. Not a single violation. The documents were meticulous. Samuel had kept records with the care of a man who knew he would be scrutinized. As they prepared to leave, the shorter agent paused. "You should consider stepping back," he said quietly, almost privately. "Ambition draws attention." Samuel met his eyes. "So does injustice." The agents left, but the damage was done, or so Whitmore believed, because even when cleared, suspicion leaves residue. That evening, attendance at the shop thinned, not drastically, just enough to be noticeable. A few regulars hesitated before entering. One supplier delayed a shipment citing restructuring. Samuel noticed. He noticed everything. And for the first time since this began, he allowed himself a moment alone after closing. He sat in the dim light of the back room, hands folded loosely in his lap. Not defeated. Not angry, but tired. He thought of the laughter in Whitmore's office months earlier. Of the inspectors, of the rumors, of the subtle ways power tests patience. David entered quietly. "They're trying to wear you down," he said. Samuel looked up. "Yes," he replied. "Why don't you fight back?" David asked, frustration trembling in his voice. "Why don't you expose them? Tell everyone what they're doing." Samuel stood slowly. "Because if I fight their way," he said, "I become what they expect." David's jaw clenched. "So, we just let them?" Samuel stepped closer, his voice lowering but strengthening. "No, we outlast them." The next morning, Samuel did something unexpected. He closed the shop. Not under order. Not under pressure. By choice. A handwritten sign appeared. On the door, "Community Assembly, noon." By midday, the street was full. Shop owners, families, apprentices, even passers-by drawn by curiosity. Samuel stood on a small wooden crate outside his store. No microphone. No grand speech prepared. Whitmore had been informed by a bank associate that the repairman was gathering a crowd. He drove down personally, standing at the edge of the block, coat collar raised against the wind. Samuel waited until the murmurs quieted. Then he spoke. "Over the past months," he began, voice steady but resonant, "there have been questions about my integrity." The crowd shifted. "I welcome questions," he continued, "because questions allow answers, and answers build clarity." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the folded newspaper from weeks before. This paper suggested uncertainty. Federal agents searched my books. Inspectors examined my walls. I stand before you cleared of every allegation. He paused. But this isn't about me. Silence deepened. It is about what happens when a man builds without asking permission from those who believe they own the future. Whitmore's jaw tightened at the edge of the crowd. Samuel's voice did not rise, but it sharpened. If my shop falls, let it fall because I failed you, not because someone whispered doubt. He stepped down from the crate. And if I have ever betrayed your trust, I will close these doors myself. The power of that sentence did not come from volume. It came from surrender. For a moment, the street was silent. Then the seamstress stepped forward first. You fixed my machine when no one else would, she said. A barber followed. You kept my heaters running in winter. A mother raised her hand. You repaired my son's radio so he could hear the ball games. One by one, voices rose, not angry. Affirming. Whitmore watched as something extraordinary happened. The narrative he had tried to control dissolved. Not because Samuel shouted, but because he offered himself to judgment without fear. The turning point had arrived. Samuel did not attack Whitmore publicly. He did not name him. He simply placed his reputation in the hands of the people who knew him best, and they refused to let it fall. Whitmore felt something cold settle in his chest. Not rage this time. Defeat. Because intimidation thrives in isolation. And Samuel Carter had just proven he was not alone. As the crowd dispersed, business resumed. Customers entered not cautiously now, but proudly. Suppliers resumed deliveries by evening. The federal inquiry quietly closed. Whitmore remained at the edge of the block longer than necessary. He had expected humiliation. Instead, he witnessed allegiance. And allegiance cannot be revoked by paperwork. Samuel returned inside and began repairing a broken clock. Tick by tick, the mechanism came back to life. David watched him closely. You won, the boy whispered. Samuel shook his head. Gently, no, he replied. We endured. Outside, Harlem breathed differently that evening. Not louder. Stronger. And somewhere in a quiet bank office across town, Harold Whitmore stared at his reflection in the dark window and realized something he had not considered before. Power without respect is fragile, and he had just watched a man prove it. By the time summer arrived in Harlem, the tension that had once hummed like a wire stretched too tight had begun to settle into something quieter, more watchful. Samuel Carter's shop no longer stood merely as a business. It stood as a symbol, not of rebellion, not of defiance, but of composure under fire. People spoke his name now with a different tone, not louder, not grander, but steadier. And for men like Harold Whitmore, that steadiness was more threatening than any protest could have been. Whitmore had not been publicly exposed. His name had never been spoken from the wooden crate on 134th Street. No accusation had been leveled. No finger pointed, and yet he felt stripped. Because he knew the machinery had moved at his urging. He knew the inspections had not been random. He knew the rumor had not been spontaneous. And he knew, perhaps most unsettling of all, that Samuel knew. But Samuel had not struck back. That was the part Whitmore could not reconcile. He expected retaliation. He expected public embarrassment. He expected to be named as villain and forced to defend his integrity in boardrooms and committees. Instead, he had been given something far heavier than humiliation. He had been given silence. And silence leaves a man alone with himself. Weeks passed. Business at the shop flourished. Apprentices multiplied. Samuel's model of partnership spread quietly to other blocks. A grocer began bartering storage space. A tailor began training neighborhood boys. Harlem, without announcement, was strengthening itself. Then something happened that no one could have predicted. The bank Whitmore managed announced internal restructuring. Investors from uptown were reevaluating portfolios. Risk exposure in certain districts, including Harlem, was being scrutinized. Whitmore had built his career on appearing cautious. But now the same cautious policies were being framed as missed opportunity. He was summoned to present quarterly reports before a panel of directors. It should have been routine. It was not. A younger executive had prepared an analysis comparing the bank's refusal to invest in Harlem, businesses with the measurable growth those businesses had achieved independently. Samuel Carter's shop was cited specifically, not by name in admiration but as data, revenue growth, employment increase, community stabilization. Whitmore sat at the long mahogany table as numbers were projected against the wall. "You classified the district as unstable," one director said coolly. "Yet independent ventures show upward trajectory." Whitmore cleared his throat. "Independent growth without institutional oversight carries volatility." Or perhaps, another director interrupted, "We misjudged the market." There it was. Misjudgment. Whitmore felt heat rise behind his collar. A week later, the announcement came quietly. Whitmore would be stepping down as branch manager pending reassignment. No scandal, no disgrace, just a polite displacement. Power had shifted. And for the first time in his career, Harold Whitmore was not in control of the narrative. Word traveled to Harlem quickly, not gleefully, simply as fact. David burst into the shop one morning holding a folded paper. "They're moving him," he exclaimed. Samuel looked up from a radio chassis. Expression unreadable. "Are they?" he asked. "Yes." David's eyes shone. He lost his position. Several apprentices murmured with satisfaction. Samuel closed the radio gently. "And what do you feel?" he asked David. David hesitated. "Like justice." Samuel studied him. "Justice," he said slowly, "is not the same as revenge." David frowned. "He tried to destroy you." Samuel stood and walked to the front window, looking out at Lenox Avenue alive with motion. "He tried to control what he did not understand," Samuel replied. "That is not the same as evil." David struggled with that. "So you feel nothing?" Samuel's reflection in the glass looked older than his years. "I feel responsibility." 3 days later, something extraordinary happened. Whitmore walked into the repair shop, not in a black sedan, not with inspectors, alone. His suit looked less sharp, his posture less certain. The bell above the door chimed softly as conversations inside stilled. Samuel looked up from the counter. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." The greeting was not ironic. It was sincere. Whitmore removed his hat, something he had not done on previous visits. "Require assistance," he said, voice lower than before. Samuel waited. Whitmore placed a small wooden box on the counter. Inside lay an old pocket watch, tarnished, delicate. "It belonged to my father," Whitmore said quietly. "It stopped working last week." Samuel lifted the watch carefully, turning it in his hands. "I see," Whitmore hesitated. "I have been informed you are thorough." The apprentices watched closely. David's jaw tightened. Samuel examined the mechanism with calm precision. "I can repair this," he said. Whitmore swallowed. "I may not be able to pay immediately." The room felt charged. This was the moment. The man who had weaponized policy, who had tried to suffocate opportunity, who had orchestrated doubt, now standing not as a superior, but as a customer. Samuel closed the watch case gently. "There will be no charge," he said. David stepped forward. "Mr. Carter." Samuel lifted a hand softly, silencing him without looking away from Whitmore. Whitmore's eyes flickered with something unfamiliar. "You owe me nothing," he said, almost defensive. "You're correct," Samuel replied. Silence lingered between them. Whitmore looked down. I misjudged you, he said. Finally, Samuel did not rush to accept the apology. Instead, he asked a question. Did you misjudge me? He said evenly. Or did you misjudge them? He gestured subtly toward the neighborhood outside the window. Whitmore followed his gaze. Children playing stickball. Shopkeepers greeting customers. Life moving steadily. Forward, his voice lowered further. Perhaps both. Samuel nodded once. Then repair begins there. It was not a condemnation. Not a lecture. It was an invitation. Whitmore stood quietly for several seconds, absorbing the weight of that sentence. For a man who had spent his life believing power came from leverage, this moment was destabilizing. Because Samuel was not leveraging his fall, he was extending dignity. And dignity, offered without condition, can dismantle pride more completely than humiliation ever could. Whitmore cleared his throat. I cannot undo what was done. No, Samuel agreed. But you can decide what you do next. There it was, the final turning point. Not a courtroom victory, not public disgrace, but a moral confrontation delivered softly. Whitmore left the shop lighter than he had entered, not because his problems were solved, but because he had been given something rare, the opportunity to become better. The pocket watch was returned a week later, ticking steadily. Whitmore arrived with payment in hand. Samuel refused it again. Instead, he slid a small envelope across the counter. Inside was a proposal, not for Samuel's shop, but for a community microloan initiative. Whitmore read it carefully. You want the bank to invest here, he said slowly. I want the bank, Samuel replied, to see clearly. Whitmore looked at him long and hard. You would trust me with this? Samuel's answer was immediate. I trust who you can become. Whitmore exhaled deeply, for the first time in his life. He felt small in a way that did not humiliate him, but humbled him. And that humility marked the true resolution. Months later, a modest fund was established. Not revolutionary, not headline-grabbing, but real. Small businesses gained access to structured loans with fair terms. The narrative of risk began to shift toward potential. Samuel never took public credit. He continued repairing clocks and radios, training apprentices, mentoring David. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Harlem, David asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. When he stood here needing help, why didn't you make him feel what you felt? Samuel smiled faintly. Because if I had, he said, I would have taught you the wrong lesson. David looked puzzled. Samuel placed the ticking pocket watch in David's hands. Strength, he said softly, is not proven when your enemy falls. It is proven when you choose who you become afterward. Outside, Harlem moved with steady rhythm, not perfect, not free of struggle, but stronger. Samuel Carter had faced humiliation, persecution, and public doubt. He had not broken. He had not retaliated. He had rebuilt. And in doing so, he transformed not only his circumstances, but the heart of the man who tried to control them. Because sometimes the most powerful victory is not defeating someone. It is refusing to become them. And that is how repair truly begins.